winner stays on lounge, which is, of course, not our normal, even a little bit. But as we're reasonably certain that we understand quite a bit about how to fight each other, even if it's flawed in some cases, or can't always be done mentally in the correct way quickly, we're gathering some more data. What happens when winning is, even if slightly subconsciously, the thing you're aiming for? Or what if your opponents, because we do occasionally get joiners, if you would like to be one of those joiners, this is mostly a US East Coast or technically Atlantic Rim lobby. If you're in Europe, you might be able to get good connections to some people and so on. We don't necessarily mind if it's a bit laggy. It does depend, but you can at least try to join up, and that's why it's important that it is winner stays on, because normally you search loser or all to find us. However, note that we still have our usual 3 consecutives limit, i.e. if you do win 3 times in a row, you still end up getting kicked back to the back. You can take a break, or you can head on out, depending on how you want to deal with it. We expect less of that though, because it will generally cause a type of floating, a type of interaction in skills that doesn't normally happen when loser stays on as the setting. But we're basically not necessarily out of things to learn, but the next thing to learn in this game after the whole shimmy and the reading people's intentions and the floating around definitely comes after considerably more practice with those things. And of course, some practice with combos and hit confirms, which can be hard to get if you are thinking too much about certain things, and if your opponent is spending more time trying to stop you from doing the thing they think, and are in a completely practice-based mindset. The stream is therefore also going to be a bit lighter on discussion, assuming that we don't get a lot of other guests. Mainly because minor discussions about specifics have been covered relatively extensively over the last few streams. We may bring up little things that people need to do differently than they've already been doing, but it's unlikely to come up a whole lot because we simply don't have that many new things to discuss. However, of course, note that if you join and are playing an unfamiliar character, you might get some input from both sides. But we would expect that anyone doing so probably knows how to play the character well enough that covering all of the things they're likely to be doing in this stream would be outside of our purview. Normally we get enough time to talk about it based on that, simply because if the character is so unfamiliar that a team member loses, they end up continuing to play, and if the person joining is playing an unfamiliar character because its loser stays on to learn something or test it out, they tend to do less things and we have a different sort of discussion. So, we're not necessarily expecting that to happen this week, obviously. And often, managing to handle a person who is confident in their character when the character is unfamiliar is not something you can do in one session. That's the nature of fighting games for the most part. Even if you understand a lot of principles, the entire point of most characters' specifics and styles is that they somehow either define those principles, mostly the starting characters that you already obviously played, or they break a lot of the little rules in their own special way that you have to learn how to get around and remember, and that's what makes it interesting. We've seen that recently for the Wolf taking up Mila, Cosmic Wolf taking up Brad Wong, but they've definitely had enough time to have everyone get at least somewhat used to the main strategies, and those characters, while they do have some little sequence breaks, let's say, specifically also use tactics that can be put to other characters that we're already aware of. Familiarity with your own character helps you get through also in terms of your tools. Though, even if characters like Neo Tengu or Rig show up, we're still expecting to mostly only end up talking about, hey, which should be your default hold, how should you try to get out of this situation, those sorts of things. That said, do expect that there will be some chatter still, particularly when something that we normally don't talk about comes up. Often, whether or not you play a certain way in this game does have at least some small influence given by the stage you're in. Generally, it's considered that most characters don't have a strongly disadvantaged or advantaged stage setup, but certain styles for those characters might, and occasionally a matchup might be disadvantageous to a character in a particular stage because it makes the matchup unfamiliar, not necessarily because it's strictly speaking harder to play. We'll talk about that a little bit more this time than usual. And more importantly, we'll most likely poke at specific stages, whether they're selected randomly or not, and transitions between stages, because setting up a stage transition to a different form of a stage that you like better or that suits you better is actually part of the tactics of DOA and has been since at least DOA 2. That stage, for example, does a better job than most of showing a particular aspect of the wake-up game here. When the player on the offense manages to get the opponent to a wall, even successful defense can still have somewhat limited outcomes. This happens in most fighting games, but it's easy to think about it here because when you have that limited outcome, when you can't specifically spend a lot of time going for pressure without moving, and have to instead spend your time making sure that you aren't the one with your back to the wall. For certain types of knockdowns, especially lighter ones or staggers, it can limit your pressure or your pressure options. You don't necessarily want to spend time on something that doesn't necessarily pay off, or that you'll end up pushed back to the corner if you mess it up, especially in a stage like that one where being pushed up against the wall specifically means that your opponent gets a longer combo than usual and more damage. Depending on what exactly they use and their character type, it can be pretty bad.
What I need is strength.
This stage, however, is almost completely opposite. You are almost always going to end up near to a wall or a corner quickly enough that spending too much time thinking about your position relative to things is only really important for zoners. Zoners want to align themselves with the center line of the stage, preferably not too near the wall, there behind, so that they don't have to deal with all of the other little things when they get trapped. Now, almost all characters can benefit from this at least a little bit, but a large part of the reason why this matters is if your opponent doesn't have enough space to put their moves out in a way that will frustrate you, you have a lot less problems. They have to make themselves use their longer moves not to check you per se, but simply to prevent themselves from having to walk back any further. And this becomes a big deal. The one with the more space behind them has a lot more flexibility and a lot more space to back into in order to change the rhythm of the fight to their advantage or to their preference. Because sometimes preference is an advantage in itself, but not necessarily a mechanical one. Understanding this as a concept of fighting games is relatively closer to mid-high than lower level, knowing that eventually you get to the point where these games aren't really about doing all your moves correctly or guessing right. They're about being comfortable and staying comfortable, and making sure that you manage that most of the time is a big enough deal that thinking about how to set it up, particularly in a game where you have to spend so much time setting it up, is important. In 2D games it's simpler. You say, okay, I'm this far away, therefore I'm good. But now you have to think, I'm this far away and I'm also, my back is to a wall, I can't go any further. My opponent has enough space to move around and space certain things perfectly and will therefore be more comfortable. Because the more comfortable opponent usually wins. This is particularly true by when people make you whiff certain moves at certain ranges, because the game has flowing forward combos. If you have nowhere to back away from the second hit of the flow, you're going to have to hold it or block it, and a lot of the time those second hits and combos are exactly what people want you to have to block, because those moves are often the ones that are powerful because they're easier to hold. They tend to be more predictable, or if they aren't predictable, they're slow, sometimes less advantaged, and so on. The second punch in a punch string is often a really good move though, and the opponent really wants you to not hold this move and definitely not outrange it. So any situation in which they can get you to have to block it is heavily advantage to you, and usually, sorry, heavy advantage to them, and usually they're really happy about it.
Don't make me laugh. cannot lose this fight. Go away.
There is nothing much to say about this stage. It's exactly what it appears to be, a boxing ring. But the one thing that is notable is that both of the boxing ring stages offer you a true corner. Other stages have a couple of things that are very similar to corners, but these ones are more potent because they actually are 90 degrees, which means that at least 3 of your cardinal directions of retreat or positioning are actually cut off if your opponent is positioned perfectly. You can only go basically forward. You can go a little bit to either side, but in terms of whether or not tracking moves are likely to hit you, pressure works well because most long tracking moves will hit someone trying to get out of the actual corner, which means you can gain extra advantage by specifically putting yourself such that your opponent is directly in the corner. And even when you are maneuvering in the mid-screen, doing a clear motion so that they end up in the corner or closer to one when you're finishing a combo instead of just bouncing off the ropes is helpful. Technically, you can do a whole tactical thing about getting there fairly early on, and that will help more than focusing too hard on managing to hit the opponent. Because if you end up cornered as a result of not paying enough attention there, then you have a lot more work to do. This is particularly true for characters like Helena, who spend a lot of time focused on footsies and need to be able to move back and forth, and particularly to sidestep things. Cornering Helena is generally weakening the character as a whole. It isn't necessarily that she does much worse in this type of stage, because it's even, it doesn't have any weird interactions other than the corners. It's specifically that if the player isn't attentive enough and ends up cornered, things go poorly. One of the most interesting parts is that mid-screen, let's say, if both characters benefit a lot from cornering the other, neither one is closer to a corner yet, which means they're more likely to line up relative to their respective corners because they are so good at the corner game or corner guard. And that basically usually means whoever wins in neutral with the biggest knockback option has a large advantage from that point on.
Yes, this is the melody.
As you'd expect, most of the characters who have these options are the boxers. The wrestlers don't tend to care as much, and they do decently either way. The ninjas, it highly depends on the opponent the ninja character is facing, more so than the actual ninja. But Footsie's characters often suffer and don't really benefit from cornering the opponent that much because they are often depending on the opponent to whiff buttons and don't necessarily have as many tracking moves or as many effective tracking moves that won't be like held or easily seen or whatever. But we're rotating back to a stage that I feel is more common than it probably actually is. I get that feeling because for some reason the stage either irks me or just catches my attention whenever I see it. The stage has some corners,
No hard feelings.
some weird wall positioning. It's one of the more complicated stages to deal with in terms of that sort of thing. It's honestly best to figure out how you feel about corners and positioning on other stages before you start thinking too hard about strategies for this one. Once again, meaning I'm not likely to have a whole lot to say here, other than the fact that obviously Helena doesn't really want to be cornered and needs to stay away from positions where she might be, and Mila obviously wants the opposite, corner Helena as fast as possible because she is one of the most advantaged characters when the opponent can't get away from her punch strengths.
Get ready. Fight!
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
I will do my best.
I cannot lose this fight.
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
Monaco presents the unique experience of a character whose moves are made up of a hodgepodge of other styles. Therefore, it's hard to judge whether or not she's disadvantaged or advantaged in any particular stage because it depends both on the player's style and how they happen to feel like playing in that moment or in that matchup. This high adaptability makes her harder to read and therefore changes the flow a lot, but isn't necessarily enough to make the opponent not be able to stick to their own game plan. If you don't want to get cornered normally, then don't. If you don't care, then don't. Honoka is not generally going to affect that too much.
Yes, this is the melody.
This is interesting because it gives her some resistance to a particular strange thing in this game. Those of you who are familiar with Street Fighter V are probably aware that the way they do things has to do with choosing stages first, because it doesn't actually matter. The stages are all functionally the same, they're just backgrounds upon which you see things. In this particular flow, characters are selected first, and then stages. Which leads to things like situations in Tekken, for example, where in tournament play you must choose random or you must change stage after every match, or similar rules that they use for that reason, because choosing the stage, depending on the character, can put one person into their comfort zone and another person out of it, even if the characters are still technically balanced. And in some cases in Tekken, as far as we know, it really doesn't remain that way. You could in fact have a situation where one character is meaningfully advantaged by which stage is chosen. But we have a different Helena to deal with now. Unlikely to have much to say about it because again, it's a character that's familiar, at least in the long term. So any slower movement from their side is less likely to be more of the same, but with less outright directives. So far, it mostly seems that we have someone who can be blocked for longer, but does more lows. Holding Helena's lows is actually fairly difficult because the timing of her lows doesn't match the timing of other people's lows, and going into her low stance actually doesn't imply she's going to use any lows. It's easier to just retreat away with Diego, because fighting from this style of Helena from too close just means you get caught in loops. You can't make her miss because she advances so much on every attack. But on the other hand, why give her even that? Diego can absolutely be played as a zoner when need be. And while he's not good at finding openings to punch people out of his face, once they're there, putting him at a disadvantage against characters who have particularly long strings, he isn't necessarily a character that takes a lot of damage for trying. So he can really just block his way through a ton of stuff and just not do anything.
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
One of the harder points in any fighting game is to not know when it is your turn to hit buttons. And DOA makes this even harder because it makes sure that you actually have to land the hold. You don't know what your opponent's character is doing, but often their strings do get to go on forever. In general, you should assume that on the first hit of anything, you should just hold mid, usually mid punch. If your opponent beats you by using a low, chances are this low is not going to lead into much damage, and in fact, because the low counter hits are so much weaker in the game, you almost always get to hold the mid right after the low anyway. Trying to hold the first hit of your opponent's string against an unfamiliar style or character is usually going to give them the round, because there's no way to know what any given person will do unless you've played the character yourself, and in this game that takes much longer because you'd have to know all of their combos. The unfamiliar combo could be completely weak in standard play, but simply win because it's unfamiliar.
Let's see how strong you are.
Hitomi has a similar flow, but not quite the same, because Hitomi doesn't have as many straight "I'm holding mid here because the string has said so." A lot of the time Hitomi is more so block and then throw. You can deal with this a little bit more easily by assuming that Hitomi is not specifically trying to get all the way up to you when she approaches, meaning you have to usually attack from further out, or attempt to use the sidestep shimmy as mentioned before. Her moves don't track that well most of the time, and you get to sidestep out of a lot of things. Fortunately for Hitomi, she doesn't really have to deal with too much of this because she does have enough low opens and overhead style moves that if you stand there and let her, or even just pause your attack for long enough, she'll move around your attack zones and you won't be able to do as much. It's partially this that makes her a difficult character to zone against, because many of your zoning moves won't get you to where you want to be, and she'll counterattack relatively quickly with some hop that either goes down or up, meaning that you don't generally know exactly what to strike. And you definitely don't know what to hold. These hops are an integral part of Hitomi game plan at mid to high level, simply because they slow down the opponent's options in close range and help her to prevent close range opponents from getting an advantage if they stay there. Often they need to back off and wait for her to whiff something, but getting her to whiff is a matter of whether or not your spacing is superior to your opponent. If not, then they will only hit the buttons at the moments where they're likely to hit you or force you to block, and you won't be able to do that much. Fortunately, these moves often can be blocked and punished. Again, you just block them and then throw. Or, in the case of the ones that do continue, because she has had to hop or go low, compared to many other characters, her follow-ups to those moves are kind of limited, meaning that you generally know what to hold. Lei Fang has similar options to Helena in this regard, but she also ends up with you having to hold the mid-kick a lot rather than the mid-punch. This is not because the mid-kick is the standard attack Lei Fang uses, but more so because when she is forced to fight someone who just blocks consistently, especially someone who is good enough at either blocking or avoiding her many relatively straightforward lows, the mid-kick, technically usually a stomp or overhead style kick, is the mix-up because you tend to react to this move as if it's a high. It's visually generally going to give the impression of being a high, and you won't necessarily, especially not at the beginning, have a flinch reaction that matches what the actual attack is. Our Lei Fang bot is actually fairly well built around this. But at the moment we're trying to see if we need to work in more mid-punches, or whether or not the reason that people tend to fail to hold mid-punch when faced with Lei Fang is simply that they don't know the timing of the character. She has a lot of wind-up style moves that don't really go into anything but the expected wind-up, and you could therefore hold mid-punch a lot of the time. But she does these things almost always at the time where the player away up against her wants to get in and thinks it's their turn. In fact, those wind-ups are often helpful primarily because they're evasive and will escape from really short buttons at basically max range, meaning that the player trying to attack often has to whiff one button and then hold, or try to get into position and then hold instead of whatever else you normally do, because she's just not going to let you hit her. Using your kicks can help, but she also tends to duck under most faster kicks. And in the end, it ends up here with her never needing to use basically any kicks at all, because our melee player doesn't necessarily hold the same flows and can't reach her.
I cannot lose this fight.
I'm giving this all I got.
Get ready. Fight!
I had no time for games. Come at me with everything you got.
I'm giving this all I got.
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
What? Does it really hurt that much?
Though the Whiff Punish throw is a massively effective tactic in this game, there are characters who are better at avoiding the situation than others. While most moves that have even decent recovery are thrown as long as the player on the opposite side can recognize that the attack's over, there are some characters who have attacks that rotate their body in such a way that they don't end up back in that zone where they can easily be thrown without a step forward on the part of the opponent. Some characters are even stronger at this by having a relatively delayed but still possible low attack that comes out of that space. And that basically sums up how Ayane handles these situations. She's not terribly easy to whiff punish for that reason. You can't be absolutely sure her attacks are over, so you can't necessarily start your whiff punish, even the throw, too early. And she does have spinning moves that don't necessarily extend her into your throw range, but could hit you if you tried to advance during them. Mostly punches. On top of all these, she has options that lead into a spin, then a low attack, which, while it basically never leads into good damage, it does mean that you're almost certainly not going to be guarding even if you realized you were too slow. You're more likely to guard mid, i.e. hold back as normal, and Ayane will get to at least poke you and stay at advantage enough to not have to worry about what comes up next. She's relatively easy to punish in these spaces, but not necessarily to beat out that way.
Get ready. Fight.
With additionally some relatively surprising range on some of those low follow-ups. She spends a lot more time controlling the match in that spacing than most characters.
Get ready. Fight.
Characters like Ayane generally are weak not to whiff punish throw, but to whiff punish mid kick, preferably your longest reaching mid kick. But sometimes it doesn't matter and your mid kick will just take her out of the second hit of whatever she was doing anyway, without you actually having to think about whether or not it will work. This does not work for all characters, and it definitely doesn't work at all ranges, but if you want to just stop Ayane from doing things in general, mid-kick is your better chance out of what you've got, because she spends so much time in animations that she often gets kicked out of them, and you don't really have to block in the first place. While she does have moves that beat this as well, they mostly only work when you get super twitchy, forcing her to spend more time on her own kicks to solve the problem. And the kicks are the things you can generally punish by throwing. This isn't really something Ayane can get around as a character other than by predicting the opponent's flow and going into holds of her own at the right timings. But since normally the mid kick from an opposing character doesn't lead into much, she doesn't necessarily care if she gets hit by them, and since she's often not being strictly speaking counter hit, she can usually hold whatever the follow-up is unless the opponent delays it.
I cannot lose this fight.
Hey, no hard feelings.
Fight.
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago?
Oh, young lady. How about a drink?
I don't have time to play games with you. Are you ready?
Get ready.
How about this?
Get ready.
Cheers! Cheers!
Our upcoming matchup, assuming everything works, is going to be a little rougher for Diego than usual because normally, while Diego does have a bunch of standard with punish options that lead into advantage if the opponent manages to block them, it's easily possible for Brad Wong to actually avoid most of these. Is it frozen? Is it dead? It's hard to tell. Our streams do have these random problems sometimes. Well, someone was coming and going, and it looks like we're now back and ready. Maybe. Maybe not. Oh, it was that, the fact that the wolf was dropping. Okay. This match is likely to be a lot more straightforward and less stressful for both players, really. Tina's main weakness against Diego is that while she does have a lot of really good grab ranges and a lot of ways to defeat Diego's pressure, she isn't quite as good at getting in, particularly if Diego aims at her legs a lot. Unfortunately for Diego, he doesn't get a lot of damage off of those, meaning that it's harder to keep winning by damage, but it isn't terribly hard to keep her out of that situation. She is, however, relatively easier to throw, because she does tend to whiff in ranges where Diego could actually do something about it. Once she is in, there's a lot to worry about. Especially since pressure is one of the things that Tina technically actually has compared to most characters. You can understand the fact, when you're learning pressure in this game, Tina's a good character to learn it on because she does pressure-y things that you have to actually respect. And watching her retreat does not mean that anything is specifically going to happen. The easiest answer to this is hold mid-kick when you don't know what else to do, but it's not going to be enough by itself. However, a lot of her stuff is easy enough to roll out of if you don't try to get up immediately, which is your probably best bet. If you are knocked down, stay down a little bit and try to move or roll to the side, especially later on, because her actual pouncing attack that defeats the person who has stayed down kind of takes long. I don't know if it's actually longer than other characters or if it just doesn't matter. She wants to stay closer because once she gets the knockdown, she can just follow up. But this also relies mostly on her being close to the wall, which means this was a pretty difficult stage to end up in, kind of countering the advantage that was going to be gained by having a character who has more options like that. The smaller stage and inability to get away from ground pressure means that you're not really able to take advantage of the space that Diego can get, or the ability to check her approaches. But in the same vein of potentially more comfortable matchups, Ayane versus Kasumi is well known well enough due to both Kasumi Bot, modified Kasumi Bot, specific for this player, and playing against me at least some of the time. The main issue here is going to be that the strength of one's ability to predict and hold is often negated by Kasumi as a character. And of course, if you actually use a lot of her longer combos, she becomes fairly frustrating. The hard part is actually getting them started. So, what this is going to come down to is the fact that our Ayane is so used to Kasumi's movement relative to other characters could lead to her having trouble getting a lot of specific combos started in the first place, and therefore not really being able to push too hard. On the other hand, once they do get started, it's really hard to know when they're going to stop or how to hold, and you just have to count on the fact that eventually you should probably be able to win out just by figuring out the right spot to go for your throw. There's not much point in worrying too much about Kasumi combos because, similar to other characters I play, the combos aren't really the problem. She builds a lot of meter using the combos, which is basically the issue you have, but that is not so big a deal either if you're not too committed to having to be able to win by your opponent not having an escape tool. You have to play more neutral because she's more capable of getting herself out of your pressure. Basically, that's it. But she will whittle you down eventually, and this more so happens when you get frustrated at specific aspects of the match. As with most characters like this, the most important thing for you to do at any given point where you don't know what's going to happen is hold forward, hold mid-kick. This is because despite looking like highs, a lot of the time these moves, these dashing moves, these long approaches are mid-kicks. Even her overhead looking kick, also mid-kick. Whenever you just feel, okay, this is weird and crazy and bullshit and I don't know what's happening, hold mid-kick simply because it prevents her from using her stronger combos, or rather her stronger openings for those combos. You can also try to outrange her, but Kasumi is not a character that really can be outranged in the standard way. She tends to know what to do positionally to get that status, and you can see here, for example, trapping an opponent in the corner is fairly trivial for Kasumi as a character. Understanding when you have to retreat, therefore, and the fact that she's going to catch you if you try, makes it all come down more and more to holding that mid-kick when she leaps at you. She does have a low that will knock you down in the same situation, but it's actually fairly telegraphed as a different move, and therefore you can generally get it. We've discussed previously on stream that a lot of the time, once you start to hold enough, what will actually happen is that the Kasumi player will run up and just throw you, because that's what they're aiming for in a lot of situations. Combos don't necessarily do as much damage as certain throws or setups based on throws that she has, so getting you to do this enough times will eventually lead to you getting thrown, and then you have to learn to tech the throw too. If you hold too early, therefore, the same problem appears. But we're back to, please just mid-kick this character. Ayane can get in on Honoka otherwise, but Honoka has enough counters and doesn't take damage when she is outplayed for trying them. And this is something we talk about really often. If Honoka goes for her hop, if she goes for her stronger long punch, or her push back punch, most of the time anything Ayane does is going to either whiff or not do a lot of damage even if it hits, and that's her biggest option here. In fact, Ayane, as you can see, ends up doing a lot of throw stuff for exactly that reason. The rest of it is just down to, can I land the mid kick, and can Ayane trick Honoka into thinking that it's time for mid kick when it isn't. Familiarity is where most of this comes from, but a lot of Ayane's options involve just holding mid-punch, and since mid-punch is generally a comfortable thing to have to hold, it simplifies the situation at least somewhat. You can see here quickly that the damage goes down a lot, but that means that the understanding of how to prevent your opponent to getting their combo open is paramount, which is exactly what happens at the mid-level of this game a lot. You have to spend a lot more time figuring out how to make sure your opponent doesn't start their good combo, because at that point, people are not necessarily going to be trying to play with the intention of just getting close to you and pushing buttons until something hits, and then confirming whatever stray they've got. They have a game plan for reaching that main hit that they know how to do. And understanding any given person's game plan helps a lot in this regard.
You were acting all tough at the beginning. What happened? cannot lose this fight.
Yeah, I'm here to fight.
Get ready. Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Get ready. Fight!
Yes, this is the melody.
Ah, fabulous. This character is hard to sum up, especially when you don't know the level of play your opponent is going to be at. The simple answer about how to deal with her is that if she's far enough away that you think she's going to do anything, use any chain you have that starts with a low to mid punch and then goes up into a higher aiming one. You can also do kicks, but I think she has a move that gets around kicks in some way. Knowing your string for this isn't necessarily common actually, and some characters just don't even have one. But Helena thankfully sorta does, and you'll see why it's necessary in a minute. The way she uses her approaches, you end up facing off with her movement a lot. But she can't always confirm if you stay at that spacing and is looking for a way to get close enough to force you to have to deal with her. However, that spacing doesn't strictly speaking exist for her. The furthest reaching low punch you've got will beat anything she does to advance in most cases, and if it follows into a high one, it'll beat most of her counterattacks. The next thing to learn about the matchup though is usually quite hard, because if you just keep on spamming this move, as our Helena tends to do when given a new option, what'll happen is that she'll just make you whiff, and in a specific spacing, she'll do her own version of the same thing as a whiff punish, and get a massively heavy mix-up situation. So, what do you really want to do in terms of long-term goals here? The first thing is, of course, sidestep, because that's Helena's strength. If you drop the sidestep, you won't be able to get her under control in the first place. The second thing is usually that you need to hit that same option after your own retreat, because having the retreat in there makes the Mariposa player less capable of landing certain jumping style attacks or mix-ups from your side. And of course, once you're in close, you have to care about what to hold, because she's not going to let you get away from close range. Meaning you must spend a lot more time finishing combos in whatever way you know will send your opponent either flying or give you a long enough knockdown to retreat from them. Fortunately, Brad Wong is up next, assuming that we don't have another glitch in the system, and Brad has similar options. In fact, Brad has technically better options in a lot of situations for the same style of thing. While he doesn't necessarily have a high striking second hit on moves, it would work out better. But it looks like our player is changing side or changing, it's hard to say. Okay. Back to Kasumi. Some recent experience with this has been helpful, but I'm not sure it's going to matter a lot. Because again, this is really about the Brad player's emotional experience with whoever they're facing. If they decide to come in via leaping attacks, there are certain stances Brad shouldn't safely use. Rushing attacks, very similar. The key here is mainly going to be how much this player is proficient at holding or stopping Brad's various low options. The more things are likely to be held, the more troublesome this is going to be for Space Wolf. But you can already see the flying attacks, the charging attacks. We've discussed before that generally Kasumi just stays slightly out of Brad's range, and every time he goes for nearly anything, does some move in and catch style attack, because he won't necessarily do anything about it in time. Well, the same sort of options that I think you might have seen on the last stream where I did this, if we streamed that. We don't always have every session on stream, but mostly. Looks to be laggy in some way, which appears to be because our Kasumi is on Wi-Fi. But most of this isn't about the lag. Most of this is entirely about the fact that Brad has to deal with Kasumi's charging at him right then. And he has to do it usually by either holding or using his backflip style kick, because he can hope that some of her attacks don't necessarily lead to her defeating that. And it tends to buy him enough space to get something else. She also doesn't necessarily get much mix-ups once he goes for it. It's more so a, I don't think you're going to use this move, therefore. And if the Kasumi player's judgment is correct, they can get some fairly long combos. But if it's wrong, Brad gets to play neutral in the way that suits him best for a little while. That said, it's a little bit easier against Space Wolf because, as we've mentioned many times, this player is someone who will mostly just repeat something as long as it's working. And it makes winning against last round or similar more simple because that's the round where you just take advantage of that fact and make sure it doesn't work. There's no way to make a comeback anymore or to switch to something new with the same principle, and therefore the last round of matches tends to be relatively one-sided one way or the other. Either the tool is just straight effective and you don't know how to get past it and you have to put up with it, or it is completely ineffective because you keep countering it and it's more or less a blow-up. Many of our team members had intended to play for a shorter period tonight, and therefore we're not necessarily closing up, but you can expect that the number of people in here, the fact that we're nearly full, isn't necessarily going to stay that way. Also, feel free to use match 2. We do have the other match spot open if you wish it, but again, that would require there to actually be space in the lounge for you to enter it. Kasumi actually gives Diego slightly more trouble than Phase 4 does. Because unlike many characters that once they get close, Diego has to either be at advantage or blocking. Diego actually does have ways away from Phase 4 because she has specific parts of her strings where she must go into the air, and he has a decent counter for that. I believe just his back punch. He also does really well using his 4K, I believe, in mid-ranges to prevent problems. But this of course depends on the previous discussion. Don't get cornered. This is another character where mostly once you're being comboed, just hold mid-punch. If you get hit by anything else, you probably don't care. It's particularly helpful as well, for Diego in particular, to use the break hold, which is basically back and special, which I don't remember, I guess it's L1 in this case. The reason this is really helpful is because Kasumi's goal, as well as Phase 4's goal, is often to get Diego so far to the corner that nothing can be done, and mashing the back S to get out of things will generally resolve this by putting Diego on the other side. It does not work against certain of Kasumi's or Phase 4's moves, and Phase 4 is generally worse about it because she spends times, as mentioned, with gaps in her strings that cause problems. You have to do it fairly early on, and if you're uncomfortable, it tends to be frustrating.
Out of my way.
I don't remember if you can just hold it, but I don't think you can. Generally, this is true of any character who suffers from being cornered against a specific character. You're not going to get a lot of options or time or chances to use your meter for anything other than, hey, I'm getting out of this now using the break hold. You can try doing it, but most of the time, because only very specific moves and very specific parts of combos are actually outright beaten by the pass-through effect of the, let's say, super, there are definitely strings that the opponent can use or even delay to cause you to just waste the entire thing to no benefit of your own, and often then you end up continuing in the corner, which is terrible.
I'm giving this all I got.
Go away.
Fight!
Like a book.
Get ready! Fight! Get ready! Fight!
Like a book.
Exploding cars! Exploding cars are a good way to get your opponent to be confused about when things are exactly ready to be going their way. Especially since, unlike most things, the exploding car combos tend to go on for a little bit longer. In fact, you can even reposition yourself a little bit after slamming someone into a car you know will explode, in order to slam them into another car you know will explode. But this is only generally a way to get an advantage in one round because the cars don't explode indefinitely. The stage can be a problem for that reason, because characters who benefit a lot from that sort of setup can have a very swingy experience based on when they choose to use it, or if their opponent can manage to trigger the exploding cars before they can. Still, mostly it's just fun, and in a longer match it tends to balance itself out.
I'll make sure you regret this.
I'm giving this all I got.
Fight!
Rachel's advantages are mostly unchanged in this game from DOA 5, but you know, not everyone was watching us back in DOA 5. The main thing you have to understand is that she has a lot of things that don't look like mid-kicks but are. A lot of mid-kicks you have to care about that do look like mid-kicks. And once she punches you at close range, you never have advantage ever. So it basically comes down to the same thing. There is a specific timing, a specific feeling that goes with, hey, I'm supposed to hold right now. And being able to make proper use of that feeling, which is what our Hitomi bot has been to teach, is how you defeat characters that are relatively straightforward in this way, that have a game plan that requires that they hit one thing enough times that you should probably be able to benefit from it. She also isn't terribly tricky in that regard. Once she starts with punches, she's probably not going to kick you if her body rotated. And that's a hard thing to learn, but at least it's learnable. Learnable is almost always better because you can always feel good about having gotten a little further with it when you do it. She's also a character that benefits from ranges that she often gets put at, and often therefore ends up going for the kick as a punish, though she absolutely can throw you in many of these situations. So it's not really that you should immediately expect it. It's going to be a problem. She is fast enough with the mid kick, especially the general standing one, similar to Honoka, where you don't really get to delay, wait to see if she goes for the hold and then get the throw. You basically have to go, oh, I hit her but I didn't confirm, I should hold mid kick now, or she blocked my combo, I should hold mid kick now, until your opponent stops doing the mid kick and goes for throw instead. The throw is actually, again, not so terrible, because it's hard to remember sometimes that you can duck under your opponent's standing throw. And a lot of the time, if you aren't super disadvantaged, you will get out of it. The reason why we specifically bring up throws as mostly a punish for situations where the character has whiffed a button is because people who are on the correct flow and expect you to throw counter will literally just crouch. If they have enough time, they'll usually make it. This is probably our last on-stream and possibly our last match of the night period. I expect that the lounge will actually close immediately for once. And that brings us to Momiji. We've seen Momiji once or twice before. We generally don't have too much to say about her because it's difficult to explain. But she's another one of those mostly you should try to mid-kick her characters. The problem with Helena is that she doesn't have a really good mid-kick that deals with the problems. And the thing you care about with Momiji is she will keep coming forward almost the entire time if she can, meaning you don't really have much ways out of her stuff except to hold. The other thing is this long delay before her attacks actually strike, which makes her difficult to hold for another reason. It isn't really that you should try to get around this by not holding Momiji. It's that technically you have to relax a lot more. You can also, as just demonstrated, sidestep a ton of her other stuff. In neutral, being able to sidestep her is decent. And generally, when the hold time comes, you only have to hold mid-punch, which isn't terrible. But our players are probably fairly tired by now.
Get ready, fight!
And Momiji always seems to end up appearing at the end of a match, set when people are already too tired to deal with all of her various new and convoluted things. So, we can expect this to be flashy, if nothing else. But join us on Monday for Street Fighter V, and check out our bots at 2-mk.org. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.